It was a busy summer morning at JFK International Airport, where travelers rushed through the gleaming terminal with their rolling suitcases and carry-on bags. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a 16-year-old African-American teenager dressed in comfortable jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and worn sneakers. His casual appearance matched that of any typical high school student heading off on a journey. Marcus approached Counter 27 of Atlantic Airways, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his phone in his hand. He had done this many times before. Checking in for flights was nothing new to him. What made this time different was that he was traveling alone for the first time, heading to a prestigious summer academic program in California. The counter was staffed by Sarah Mitchell, a gate agent who had been working with Atlantic Airways for 8 years. She greeted the next person in line with a practiced smile, but her expression changed subtly when Marcus stepped forward. Her eyes moved from his casual attire to the first-class ticket he had pulled up on his phone. "Good morning," Marcus said politely, holding out his phone to display his ticket and ID. "I'm here to check in for flight AA 247 to Los Angeles." Sarah's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she looked at the ticket information, then back at Marcus. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice carrying a note of skepticism. "This shows a first-class reservation." Marcus nodded, maintaining his composure. "Yes, that's correct. Seat 2A. The gate agent's lips pressed into a thin line as she began typing into her computer. Around them, the usual airport sounds continued, announcements echoing over the PA system, the steady hum of conversations, and the rolling of luggage across the polished floor. "Could you please show me your ID again?" Sarah asked, her tone becoming more formal. "And may I ask how you purchased this ticket?" Marcus felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach. He'd experienced similar situations before, though never at an airport. He pulled out his student ID and driver's permit, placing them carefully on the counter. The ticket was purchased through the airline's website, he explained calmly, just as his father had taught him to do in such situations. Behind Marcus, the line was growing longer. A few passengers began to shift impatiently, checking their watches and phones. Sarah called over her supervisor, John Peters, speaking to him in hushed tones while occasionally glancing at Marcus. The supervisor approached with an air of authority. "Young man, there seems to be some confusion with your booking. First-class tickets are quite expensive, and we need to verify the payment method used." Marcus took a deep breath, remembering his father's words about maintaining dignity in difficult situations. He opened his phone again, showing them the confirmation email and payment receipt. "Everything was processed normally through the airline system," he explained. "Is there a specific problem with my ticket?" The growing tension at the counter began to attract attention from nearby passengers. Some watched with curiosity, others with discomfort, seeming to understand what was unfolding. John Peters cleared his throat. "Well, you understand we have to be careful about unusual situations. Perhaps there's been a system error. We can offer you a seat in economy class." Marcus felt his heart racing, but his voice remained steady. "There's no error. I have a confirmed first-class reservation, and I'd like to be checked in for my flight, please." More airline staff gathered nearby, whispering among themselves. The situation was quickly escalating from a simple check-in to something more complicated. Marcus could feel the weight of stares from other passengers, some sympathetic, others judgmental. He reached for his phone again, this time to make a call he hadn't wanted to make. His father had always encouraged him to handle situations independently, but this was becoming more than a simple misunderstanding. As he dialed the number, Marcus caught fragments of conversation between the staff. "Must be a mistake. Can't be right. Should we call security?" The phone rang in his hand as he stood there, surrounded by growing tension and unspoken assumptions. In those moments, Marcus thought about all the conversations his father had with him about dignity, about proving people wrong through actions rather than words, and about the reality of facing prejudice. What no one at Counter 27 realized was that this situation was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would shake the very foundation of their assumptions. The tension at Counter 27 continued to build as Marcus stood his ground, phone pressed to his ear. Other passengers watched the scene unfold, some recording with their phones, others shaking their heads at the obvious discrimination taking place. Sarah Mitchell, the gate agent, was now frantically reviewing the passenger manifest on her computer screen. Her supervisor, John Peters, stood beside her with his arms crossed, occasionally glancing at his watch as if the whole situation was merely an inconvenient delay in his schedule. "I'm sorry, we need to verify the payment method used for this ticket," Peters insisted, his voice carrying a tone of authority that barely masked his assumptions. "It's unusual for someone your age to be traveling first class alone." Marcus lowered his phone, still on hold with his father's office. "Is it unusual, or is it unusual for someone who looks like me?" he asked quietly, his words causing several nearby passengers to pause and listen. An elderly woman in line spoke up from behind Marcus. "I've been watching this whole thing, and it's absolutely disgraceful. This young man has shown you his ticket and ID. What more do you need?" The situation was drawing more attention now. A business traveler in a suit stepped forward. "I fly first class weekly, and I've never seen anyone's ticket questioned like this. This is clearly profiling." John Peters raised his hands defensively. "We're simply following protocol for unusual situations." "What's unusual about a passenger with a valid ticket?" Marcus interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. "I've shown you everything you've asked for. The payment cleared. The ticket is confirmed. What's the real issue here?" More staff members gathered around the counter, creating an intimidating presence. A security officer started making his way toward the growing commotion, radio in hand. Marcus's phone finally connected. "Yes, this is Marcus Thompson. I'm trying to reach my father. Yes, I understand he's in a meeting, but this is urgent. I'm at the Atlantic Airways counter, and there seems to be a problem with my ticket." The supervisor's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Marcus's last name, but he remained skeptical. "Look, young man, we can offer you an economy seat, or you can rebook your flight, but we need to move this line along." A woman in a business suit stepped out of line. "I'm an attorney, and I'm witnessing this entire interaction. Would you like me to stay as a witness?" she offered to Marcus, who nodded gratefully. The security officer arrived at the counter. "What seems to be the problem here?" Before anyone could respond, Marcus's phone crackled with a new voice, his father's secretary. "Marcus, your father is stepping out of his meeting now. He wants to know exactly where you are." The growing crowd of onlookers had created a scene that was impossible to ignore. Other airline staff members began to look uncomfortable, perhaps realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond a simple ticket verification. "I'm at counter 27, Marcus spoke into the phone, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "They're refusing to check me in for my first-class seat, suggesting there must be some mistake." The security officer looked between Marcus and the airline staff, assessing the situation. More passengers had stopped to witness the scene, many openly recording with their phones now. The incident was quickly becoming a social media moment, though no one realized just how viral it would soon become. Sarah, the gate agent, was now frantically whispering to her supervisor, perhaps sensing that they had made a serious error in judgment. The atmosphere was charged with tension, discomfort, and the growing realization that something was very wrong with how this situation had been handled. Marcus stood tall, his phone still in hand, waiting. He had been raised to handle difficult situations with grace and dignity, but this was testing even his well-practiced patience. The looks of pity from some passengers and the open outrage from others only added to the complexity of the moment. Little did anyone at counter 27 know that in just a few minutes, their entire world would be turned upside down. The true nature of Marcus's connection to Atlantic Airways was about to be revealed, and the consequences of their assumptions would echo through the entire airline industry. James Thompson sat in the executive boardroom on the top floor of Atlantic Airways headquarters, just 15 minutes from JFK Airport. He was in the middle of a quarterly meeting with the airline's board of directors when his secretary interrupted with an urgent message about his son. The room fell silent as James, an imposing figure in his tailored navy suit, stood up from his chair at the head of the table. Few people knew that the CEO of Atlantic Airways was African American. He had deliberately kept a low profile since acquiring the airline 5 years ago, avoiding publicity and rarely appearing in company photographs or media events. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to take a brief recess," he announced to the board members. "There's a situation at Terminal 4 that requires my immediate attention." As James strode toward the elevator, His mind raced back to the conversations he had with Marcus about navigating a world that would often judge him based on appearance. He had worked hard to build his empire from nothing, starting with a small cargo company and eventually acquiring Atlantic Airways through smart business moves and strategic partnerships. In his office, photographs told the story of his journey. Pictures of him as a young entrepreneur, images of his family, and the day he acquired the airline. But most significant was a photo of him and Marcus at a small airport when his son was just 7 years old, both of them sitting in the cockpit of James's first small aircraft. James had deliberately kept his ownership of the airline quiet, wanting his children to develop their own identities without the weight of his success defining them. He had taught them the value of hard work, dignity, and resilience. Marcus, in particular, had embraced these lessons, never using his father's name to gain advantages. As his private elevator descended, James received text updates about the situation unfolding at Counter 27. Social media was already buzzing with videos of the incident, though no one had yet made the connection between the young passenger and the airline's owner. His phone rang. It was the head of public relations, sounding worried. "Sir, we're seeing multiple social media posts about a discriminatory incident at JFK. It's gaining traction quickly." "Sandra," James replied calmly, "prepare a statement, but don't release anything yet. I'm handling this personally." The car waiting outside the headquarters building whisked James toward Terminal 4. During the short drive, he reflected on why he had chosen to keep his ownership private. He wanted to see how his airline really operated, how his employees treated all passengers, not just those they thought were important. His security team had already radioed ahead, but he instructed them to wait before announcing his arrival. He wanted to see the situation exactly as it was, uninfluenced by his presence. In the terminal, live streams and social media posts continued to multiply. The incident was becoming a perfect example of the everyday discrimination his son had been prepared to face, though this time it was happening at his own airline. James checked his phone one last time before entering the terminal. Messages were pouring in from board members who had just realized the connection between the incident and their CEO's sudden departure from the meeting. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him, his son being denied access to first class on an airline he effectively owned. It was exactly the kind of teachable moment he had always used to prepare his children for the world they would face. As he walked through the terminal toward Counter 27, James Thompson straightened his tie and took a deep breath. In a few moments, he would reveal a truth that would transform a humiliating incident into a powerful lesson about prejudice and assumptions in corporate America. The security cameras throughout the terminal captured his purposeful stride, recording what would soon become a historic moment in Atlantic Airways history. The hidden truth was about to become very public, and the impact would extend far beyond just one check-in counter at JFK Airport. Marcus's phone conversation with his father's office had created a ripple of activity that was now spreading through the upper levels of Atlantic Airways. Linda Chen, James Thompson's executive secretary for the past decade, had immediately recognized the serious nature of the situation. Inside the executive office suite, Linda was coordinating a series of rapid communications. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as she sent urgent messages to the airline's legal department, public relations team, and security personnel. Having worked closely with the Thompson family for years, she knew exactly how James would want this handled. "Marcus," Linda spoke firmly into the phone, "your father is on his way. Stay exactly where you are." She could hear the chaos in the background, the murmur of angry passengers, the defensive voices of airline staff, and the growing crowd of onlookers. Meanwhile, at Counter 27, the airline staff remained unaware of the storm that was about to break. Sarah Mitchell, the gate agent, was now frantically searching through passenger records, perhaps beginning to sense that she had made a terrible mistake. Her supervisor, John Peters, maintained his authoritative stance, though beads of sweat had begun to form on his forehead. The attorney who had stepped forward to support Marcus was now taking detailed notes on her phone, documenting every word and action. Other passengers had formed a protective circle around the young man, their phones recording the ongoing discrimination. "Can you confirm your father's name for our records?" Sarah asked Marcus, her voice now carrying a hint of uncertainty. The question hung in the air as Marcus looked at his phone, where Linda was still on the line. Linda, from her desk, could hear the question through the phone. She closed her eyes briefly, knowing what was coming. In all her years managing the office of Atlantic Airways CEO, she had witnessed many moments of revelation, but this one would be unprecedented. "Miss Chen," Marcus spoke into the phone, his voice calm despite the situation. "Should I tell them?" Linda glanced at the framed photo on her desk, one showing James and Marcus at the company's last private Christmas party, both of them laughing as they stood near the cockpit of the airline's newest aircraft acquisition. "Your father says to hold on just a few more minutes. He's almost there." The security officer at the counter was now on his radio, speaking in hushed tones. Word had begun to spread through the terminal staff that something unusual was happening. Senior airline staff members were suddenly appearing, drawn by the commotion and the growing social media attention. In the background, Linda could hear the supervisor's voice becoming less certain. "Young man, perhaps if you could just explain who your father is?" Marcus maintained his composure, exactly as his father had taught him. "My father will be here shortly to explain everything," he said simply, causing another wave of whispers among the gathering crowd. Linda monitored the security feeds on her computer screen, watching James Thompson's progress through the terminal. She knew that in moments, this situation would transform from a story about discrimination into something that would shake the entire airline industry. The tension at Counter 27 had reached a breaking point. Some passengers were demanding the names of the airline staff involved. Others were calling for immediate action from airline management. The supervisor's attempts to control the situation had long since failed. Through the phone, Linda heard the first gasps and murmurs as James Thompson appeared at the terminal entrance. She could picture the scene without needing to see it. The commanding presence of the CEO, the sudden recognition on the faces of senior staff members, and the dawning realization of what was about to unfold. "Marcus," Linda said softly into the phone, "your father has arrived." The phone call that had started this chain of events was about to end, but its impact would resonate through the halls of Atlantic Airways for years to come. Linda Chen sat back in her chair, knowing she was witnessing a moment that would change not just the airline, but perhaps the entire industry's approach to bias and discrimination. The atmosphere at Counter 27 transformed instantly as James Thompson approached. His presence commanded attention. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his confident stride and authoritative bearing causing airline staff members to straighten instinctively as they recognized their CEO. Senior staff members who had been observing the situation suddenly became pale, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they realized the magnitude of their error. Sarah Mitchell, the gate agent who had first questioned Marcus's ticket, froze at her computer terminal, her hands hovering motionless above the keyboard. "Good morning," James spoke, his deep voice carrying across the now hushed terminal. "I understand there's some confusion about my son's first-class ticket." The word "son" echoed through the crowd, followed by gasps and whispers. John Peters, the supervisor who had been so insistent about protocol moments earlier, now looked as though he might faint. His face had drained of all color as the full impact of the situation hit him. "Mr. Thompson, sir. We didn't." Peters stammered, but James raised a hand, silencing him. Marcus stood quietly beside his father, maintaining the same dignified composure he had shown throughout the ordeal. The contrast between how he had been treated minutes ago and the current reaction to his father's presence was stark and telling. "I'd like to see the exact documentation you requested from my son," James continued. His voice remained measured but carried an edge that made everyone within earshot stand straighter. "And then you can explain to me why a confirmed first-class ticket holder was treated this way at my airline." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with phones still recording every moment. The attorney who had stepped forward earlier was now frantically taking notes, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief at the unfolding scene. Sarah Mitchell's computer screen still showed Marcus's ticket information, the same information she had questioned repeatedly. Now, with James Thompson standing before her, the legitimacy of the ticket seemed glaringly obvious. "Sir," a senior operations manager pushed forward through the crowd, "I've just been informed of the situation. Please allow me to." "Allow you to what?" James interrupted, his voice remaining calm but carrying authority that silenced everyone. "Allow you to explain why my son, holding a valid first-class ticket, was subjected to this treatment? Or perhaps explain why your staff's first instinct was to assume fraud rather than provide service?" The terminal had become so quiet that the distant announcements echoing through the building seemed unusually loud. Passengers who had been in line now stood transfixed, witnessing what would surely become a viral moment in airline history. James turned to address the gathered crowd, his presence commanding complete attention. What you've witnessed today is unfortunately not unique. What makes it unique is that it happened to the son of the airline's owner. How many other passengers face this same treatment without having someone who can walk in and stop it? The security officer who had been called earlier was now backing away slowly, trying to make himself invisible. Other airline staff members who had gathered to watch the confrontation were suddenly finding reasons to be elsewhere. Marcus finally spoke, his voice clear and confident. "Dad, I was just trying to check in for my flight to the academic program." James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about pride and support. "And you handled it exactly as we discussed, with dignity and strength." The revelation continued to ripple through the terminal. Passengers who had witnessed the entire incident were now sharing knowing looks, understanding they had just observed something significant. This wasn't just about one check-in gone wrong. It was a moment that would force an entire airline to confront its biases. James Thompson turned back to the counter staff, who seemed to be trying to make themselves as small as possible. "Now," he said, "let's discuss how we're going to ensure this never happens again at Atlantic Airways." The weight of those words hung in the air, promising changes that would extend far beyond this one incident at Counter 27. James Thompson surveyed the tense scene before pulling up two nearby chairs, gesturing for Sarah Mitchell and John Peters to sit down. The crowd watched in surprise as the CEO of Atlantic Airways chose to turn this moment of confrontation into something entirely different. "Everyone who isn't directly involved, please continue with your travels," James announced calmly. "Sarah, John, Marcus, let's talk." His voice was firm but measured, carrying none of the anger that many had expected. The gate agent and supervisor sat stiffly, their faces a mixture of fear and shame. Marcus took a seat beside his father, maintaining the same composure he'd shown throughout the incident. A few senior airline officials hovered nearby, unsure whether to stay or leave. "First," James began, "I want you to understand that I'm not here to fire anyone. I'm here because this is a teaching moment that we cannot waste." He looked directly at Sarah and John, who seemed surprised by his approach. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Thompson, sir, I am so deeply sorry. I never meant to." "Tell me," James interrupted gently, "what was your first thought when you saw Marcus approach with a first-class ticket?" The gate agent struggled to find words, but James pressed on. "Be honest. This only works with honesty." Sarah swallowed hard. "I assumed there must be a mistake. A teenager in casual clothes, traveling alone in first class. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made." John Peters nodded slowly, adding, "We're trained to watch for unusual situations, but we let our biases define what's unusual." James leaned forward in his chair. "My son and I have had many conversations about moments like this. Marcus, would you share what we discussed?" Marcus straightened in his chair. "We talked about how people will make assumptions about me based on how I look or how I dress. Dad always says it's not enough to just be angry. We have to help people learn and do better." The surrounding airport noise seemed to fade as James continued. "Every day, passengers of color face these small moments of doubt, these extra questions, these assumptions. Most don't have a father who owns the airline to come and address it." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. Other airline staff members who had gathered closer were taking notes, recording this impromptu lesson from their CEO. "Here's what we're going to do," James announced. "Starting tomorrow, I want both of you to work with our training department. Your experience today will help us develop new protocols. We'll use this incident, without names, as a case study for all our staff." John Peters looked up, surprised. "You want us to help change the training?" "Who better?" James replied. "You've just learned this lesson in the most powerful way possible. Now you can help others learn it without having to make the same mistake." Marcus watched as the tension in the gate agents' faces slowly transformed into understanding. This was why his father had kept his ownership quiet, to see the real airline, not the version that would be presented to the owner. "Every passenger who walks up to this counter," James continued, "whether they're in flip-flops or formal wear, deserves the same level of respect and service. The first-class ticket in their hand is the only qualification they need. The lesson continued for several more minutes, with James turning what could have been a moment of punishment into one of transformation. Staff members who had been fearfully watching now gathered closer, listening intently as their CEO outlined his vision for change. By the time James finished speaking, Sarah and John had moved from fearing for their jobs to understanding their new role in changing the airline's culture. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about transforming how an entire company thought about service, respect, and assumptions. The learning moment at Counter 27 would soon become legend within Atlantic Airways, but its real impact would be felt in the thousands of daily interactions between airline staff and passengers that would follow. 6 months after the incident at Counter 27, Atlantic Airways had undergone a remarkable transformation. The terminal where Marcus Thompson had once been denied his rightful seat now displayed a large banner reading "Every passenger, every journey, equal respect." Sarah Mitchell, once the gate agent who questioned Marcus's ticket, now stood before a classroom of new airline employees. Her experience had transformed her into one of the airline's most effective trainers on bias awareness. The incident that nearly cost her job had become a powerful teaching tool. "I want you to picture this," Sarah began, addressing the room of trainees. "A teenager approaches your counter. Your first thought might be to question their ticket. But that thought? That's where bias begins. Let me tell you a story that changed not just my career, but my entire perspective." Throughout the airline's network, changes were evident everywhere. New training protocols had been implemented, featuring real-world scenarios and interactive sessions focused on recognizing and overcoming unconscious bias. John Peters, the former supervisor, had become instrumental in developing these programs. In the executive offices, James Thompson sat reviewing the latest customer satisfaction reports. The numbers showed a significant improvement in passenger experiences across all demographics. But more importantly, the internal culture of Atlantic Airways had shifted dramatically. Marcus, now a regular presence at the airline's headquarters when not in school, had taken an active role in the company's transformation. His experience had become the catalyst for a comprehensive review of all customer service policies. The training program he helped develop, Flying Equal, had become mandatory for all employees. The incident had also sparked changes beyond Atlantic Airways. Other airlines began examining their own practices, leading to industry-wide discussions about discrimination and bias in air travel. Trade magazines featured Atlantic Airways' transformation as a case study in corporate responsibility and cultural change. Linda Chen, still James' executive secretary, maintained a special wall in the office dedicated to tracking the company's progress. News articles, passenger testimonials, and implementation reports covered the surface, telling the story of an airline that had turned a moment of shame into an opportunity for growth. One afternoon, a group of airline executives visited Counter 27, now known throughout the company as the Change Point. They watched as Sarah handled check-ins, treating each passenger with the same level of respect and courtesy, regardless of their appearance or ticket class. The security officer who had been called during Marcus's incident was now leading workshops on de-escalation and proper intervention techniques. His sessions emphasized understanding situations before making assumptions, and his first-hand experience added credibility to his teachings. In the employee break room, a new tradition had emerged. Staff members shared their own stories of recognizing and overcoming bias, creating an open dialogue that helped prevent similar incidents. The walls featured photographs of diverse passengers and employees, reinforcing the message of inclusion. The airline's booking system had been updated to remove any visual cues that might trigger unconscious bias during the check-in process. The focus was now entirely on the ticket's validity, not the passenger's appearance or demographic information. James Thompson's decision to use the incident as a teaching moment rather than a punishment had paid off beyond expectations. Employee morale had improved, customer complaints had decreased, and Atlantic Airways had become known as an industry leader in equitable service. Marcus's academic program peers were surprised to learn that he was the catalyst for such significant changes in the airline industry. He often shared his story during school presentations, emphasizing how negative experiences could be transformed into positive change. The training center at Atlantic Airways headquarters now included a special section called the Marcus Thompson Initiative, dedicated to ongoing education about bias and discrimination. New employees learned about the incident not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of how learning from mistakes could lead to meaningful progress. As Sarah concluded her training session, she always ended with the same message. Remember, every passenger who approaches your counter has a story. Your job isn't to judge that story, but to ensure their journey begins with respect and dignity. The changes at Atlantic Airways proved that one incident, handled with wisdom and foresight rather than anger and punishment, could transform not just a company, but an entire industry's approach to customer service and human dignity. 1 year after the incident at Counter 27, Marcus Thompson sat in a glass-wall conference room at Atlantic Airways headquarters, leading his first junior board meeting. At 18, he had become the youngest member of the airline's newly formed Youth Advisory Board, a direct result of the changes his experience had sparked. The conference room overlooked the same terminal where he had once been denied his first-class seat. Now, that terminal served as a model for inclusive customer service across the entire aviation industry. A plaque near Counter 27 read, "Where change took flight, dedicated to equal service for all." Sarah Mitchell and John Peters, once at the center of the controversy, had been promoted to lead the airline's diversity and inclusion training division. Their personal transformation story had become legendary within the company, proving that learning from mistakes could lead to professional growth rather than career endings. Last month's passenger satisfaction scores reached an all-time high. Marcus announced to the junior board members, a diverse group of young people aged 16 to 21. But more importantly, our discrimination complaint rates have dropped by 95% since last year. The Youth Advisory Board had become Marcus's passion project. Together with his father, he had designed it to bring fresh perspectives to the airline's policies. Each member represented different backgrounds and experiences, ensuring that future decisions would consider all viewpoints. In the main terminal, a documentary crew was filming a special about the airline's transformation. They interviewed passengers who shared stories of exceptional service, regardless of their appearance or ticket class. The airline's story had become a case study in business schools across the country. James Thompson watched proudly from his office as his son conducted the meeting. The incident that could have been just another story of discrimination had instead become a catalyst for industry-wide change. Other airlines have begun implementing similar training programs, often consulting with Atlantic Airways for guidance. The company's annual report now included a special section on inclusive practices and their impact on business success. Revenue had increased as passengers actively chose Atlantic Airways for its commitment to equal treatment. The airline had become known as the People's Carrier, a nickname that reflected its transformed culture. Marcus concluded the meeting by sharing plans for the next phase of development, a scholarship program for underprivileged youth interested in aviation careers. The program would provide not just education funding, but guaranteed internships and mentorship opportunities. Later that afternoon, Marcus walked through the terminal with his father. They stopped at Counter 27, now staffed by a new generation of employees trained under the revised protocols. Each staff member wore a small pin that read "Dignity in Flight," a reminder of the values they now embodied. "Did you ever imagine that day would lead to all this?" Marcus asked his father as they watched passengers checking in smoothly, each receiving the same professional treatment. James smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most difficult moments. You turned your experience into something that helps others." The terminal buzzed with activity. Families checking in for vacations, business travelers rushing to meetings, students heading to school. But now, there was a noticeable difference in how each person was treated, with equal respect, dignity, and service. Atlantic Airways had become more than just an airline. It was now a symbol of how corporate culture could evolve when leadership chose education over punishment, understanding over anger. The company's training programs were being studied and replicated across various industries. As the sun set over the airport, casting long shadows through the terminal's windows, Marcus prepared for his own flight, once again in first class, but this time as a recognized leader in the company. The same counter where he had once faced discrimination now served as a reminder of how far they had come. The legacy of that day continued to grow, touching lives far beyond the walls of Atlantic Airways. It proved that one moment of injustice, handled with wisdom and foresight, could spark a movement that changed not just an airline, but the way people thought about equality in service. And for Marcus Thompson, it was just the beginning. As he boarded his flight, he carried with him plans for even more changes, ensuring that the legacy of Counter 27 would continue to inspire positive transformation for years to come.